The clock on the wall read 02:14, but inside the Joint Intelligence Operations Center, time didn't move the way it did anywhere else. There were no windows, no sense of night or day, just the cold blue light of monitors stacked 3 high at every workstation and the low hum of air conditioning fighting against the heat thrown off by 100 running servers. Major Olivia Hayes had been at her desk for 6 hours, and she would be there for 6 more. She didn't mind. This was the part of the war most people never saw. Not the dust and the gunfire, but the quiet rooms where decisions about who lived and who died got made by people staring at satellite photographs and call logs, trying to be certain about things that were never fully certain. On her left monitor, a grid of black and white imagery showed a compound outside a small town in a province she'd learned to pronounce correctly only after a year on this account. 3 buildings, a low wall, a vehicle that came and went on no fixed schedule. On her right monitor, a stack of signal intercepts scrolled past, translated and annotated by a team 3 time zones away. In the center, the target package, 31 pages, soon to be reduced to a single paragraph that someone in a cockpit or a command tent would read in under a minute before making a decision that couldn't be undone. Olivia had read those 31 pages twice already. She was reading them a 3rd time because something about the rhythm of the place bothered her, and she had learned a long time ago not to ignore that feeling, even when she couldn't yet explain it. She didn't talk about why she'd learned that. Most of the people she worked with didn't know about Daniel. Her younger brother, 2 years out of high school when he joined the Marines, 23 when a strike went forward on intelligence that turned out to be 3 days old by the time it mattered. Nobody had done anything wrong, exactly. The system had worked the way it was supposed to work. It just hadn't worked fast enough or carefully enough. And Daniel had been standing in the wrong place when the picture changed, and nobody caught it in time. Olivia had been a 2nd lieutenant then, fresh out of training, nowhere near any operation that mattered. She remembered standing in her mother's kitchen, watching her mother fold the same dish towel over and over without seeming to notice she was doing it, and thinking, somebody missed something. Somebody had the information and missed it. She had spent 12 years since then making sure she didn't become that somebody. It made her good at her job. It also made her tired in a way that had nothing to do with hours slept. She kept a photo of Daniel in her desk drawer, not on top of the desk. She didn't need it where people could ask about it, but close enough that she knew it was there. Now she pulled up the pattern of life data again, the long record of comings and goings at the compound stretching back 11 days. Vehicle arrivals, departures, heat signatures at night that the analysts had logged as consistent with armed personnel, low number, irregular shift rotation. Something about the early morning hours didn't sit right with her. She isolated the timestamps and laid them against the original human intelligence report, the one that had first flagged the compound as a weapons cache 6 weeks earlier. The human report described the site as operational only, manned by a small cell, no families present, no civilian activity. That assessment had held for 6 weeks. It was the foundation everything else had been built on. But 3 of the last 5 nights, the thermal imagery showed smaller heat signatures moving close to the ground near the 2nd building, low to the floor, in patterns that didn't match adult movement. They moved in short bursts and then went still for long stretches. It was the kind of detail easy to miss if you were looking at 100 other things, and easy to explain away if you wanted the picture to stay simple. Olivia sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. It could be nothing. Dogs. A goat pen she hadn't accounted for. A relative's child visiting for a few nights, gone again by morning, irrelevant to the larger picture. She had seen pattern of life data throw off shadows like this before, shadows that meant nothing once you ran them down. But the strike window opened in 19 hours, and once it opened, there would be no time left to ask the question she was asking right now. She marked the timestamps, exported the thermal frames into a separate file, and sat for a moment with her hand resting on the mouse, not moving. Down the row of workstations, Master Sergeant Frank Dell was on the phone with someone, laughing quietly at something, completely unaware that in the next few minutes, Olivia was going to walk over and ask him to defend 6 weeks of work he believed in. She picked up the folder anyway. She had learned, a long time ago, what it cost to stay quiet when something didn't add up. Frank Dell had been doing this work since before Olivia commissioned. He was 51, built like a man who'd spent his 20s carrying radios up mountains and his 30s learning to sit still in front of a screen, and he wore the same expression whether he was looking at satellite imagery or a vending machine that had eaten his dollar. A kind of patient, unimpressed calm that made him either very easy to work with or very hard to argue with, depending on the day. He hung up the phone as Olivia approached, already reading her face. "You've got the look," he said. "What look?" "The look where you're about to tell me something I'm not going to want to hear, but you're going to be polite about it first." Olivia pulled a chair over without being asked and set the folder down between them. "I want to walk through the pattern of life on the compound, the last 5 nights specifically." Frank's jaw tightened, just slightly. Not anger, more like a man bracing for a draft from an open door. "I've walked through it, twice. So has the team in Tampa. It's a clean package, Olivia. 6 weeks of consistent signal, consistent movement, a human source that's been reliable on 3 previous taskings. I'm not saying the source is bad." She opened the folder and turned the laptop so the thermal frames faced him. "I'm saying these 3 nights don't match the rest of the pattern. Look at the movement near the second building. Low to the ground, short bursts, long stillness in between. That's not the same signature as the rest of the set." Frank leaned in, and for a moment his face did something honest. A flicker of attention, the look of a man who respected the data even when he didn't want to. Then it closed back up. "Could be animals," he said. "Could be a kid playing in a yard at 3 in the morning because it's too hot to sleep inside. You know how this works, Liv. You can find a shadow in anything if you stare at it long enough. I know how it works because I've stared at it for 4 hours." She kept her voice level. This wasn't the first disagreement she'd had with Frank, and it wouldn't be the last, but she'd learned that raising her voice with him only gave him a reason to dig in. "I'm not telling you the assessment is wrong. I'm telling you there's a piece of it I can't explain, and we've got 19, now 18, hours before the window opens. And if we slow this down to chase a shadow, and the shadow's nothing, we lose the window. The source put eyes on this 6 weeks ago. The cell rotates locations. If we miss this window, we might not get another clean shot at them for months. People downrange are counting on this going forward on schedule." Frank rubbed the back of his neck. "I built this package. I stand behind it." "I know you do." Olivia closed the folder, not in surrender, but because she could see the conversation reaching the edge of where it could go between the two of them. "I'm not asking you to scrap it. I'm asking for a few more hours to run this down properly before it goes up the chain as final." Frank studied her for a long moment. Whatever tension was between them, it didn't come from dislike. If anything, it came from 2 people who respected each other's judgment and didn't like watching that judgment get challenged. He'd trained analysts who now outranked him. She was one of the few who still came to him before going around him, and he knew it. "You're going to take this to Marsh," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have to. It's going to look like you're second-guessing 6 weeks of work over 3 nights of thermal noise." "Maybe." Olivia stood, tucking the folder under her arm. "Or maybe it's going to look like someone did her job." Frank didn't answer right away. He looked back at his screen, at the same imagery he'd been living inside for over a month, and something in his shoulders dropped half an inch. Not agreement, but the particular tiredness of a man who has been doing this work long enough to know that being sure and being right were not always the same thing. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I hope it's nothing. Not because I want to be right, because I don't want to think about what it means if it's something." "I know," Olivia said. "That's the part neither of us wants to be wrong about." She left him there, the blue light of his monitor washing over a target package that had taken 6 weeks to build, and that one analyst's unease could still unravel in 18 hours, or could fail to unravel, if the next person up the chain decided a feeling about thermal shadows wasn't enough to slow down a war. Olivia walked back toward her own desk, past rows of people doing the same quiet, invisible work she did. None of them looking up. All of them trusting that somewhere in this building, someone was checking the things that needed checking. She had 18 hours, a folder full of doubt, and a supervisor down the hall who had already signed his name to the package she was about to question. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh's office was smaller than his rank suggested. A converted storage room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot instead of anything resembling sky. He was on his second cup of coffee when Olivia knocked, and from the way he set down his pen, she could tell he already suspected this wasn't going to be a short conversation. "Major Hayes," he gestured to the chair across from him. "Tell me this is good news." "It's not bad news yet, sir. I want to keep it that way." She laid out the same case she'd given Frank. The thermal signatures, the timing inconsistency, the gap between what the human report described and what 3 nights of imagery seemed to be showing. Marsh listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she respected about him. He had a reputation for letting people finish their thought before he started picking it apart. When she finished, he sat back and rubbed his jaw. "You understand what you're asking," he said. It wasn't unkind, just direct. "I'm asking for a verification pass before the package goes final. That's all." "That's not all, and you know it." He tapped the desk lightly. "This package is already signed off. Mine, Frank's, 2 levels above me. The window opens in 17 hours. If I go back up the chain now and say we need to slow down because one analyst noticed something in the thermal data that the rest of the team didn't flag, I'm not just questioning the target. I'm questioning 6 weeks of work, a human source with 3 prior taskings, and the judgment of everyone who already signed their name to this." "I understand that, sir." "Do you?" Marsh leaned forward. "Because here's the part nobody tells you when you're starting out in this job, and I think it's time somebody did. If you're wrong, if this is nothing, if it's a dog or a kid sleeping outside because the house was too hot, you don't just lose a few hours. You cost the ground team their window, maybe their only clean window. And every time you raise something like this and it turns out to be nothing, the next time you raise something, it carries less weight." "That's not fair, but it's true. People remember when you cried wolf, even if you didn't mean to." Olivia held his gaze. "And if I say nothing, and it's not nothing?" Marsh didn't answer right away. The silence sat between them, neither comfortable nor performative, just 2 people who understood exactly what the other was carrying. "Then I live with it," Olivia said quietly, when he didn't speak. "Same as I'd live with it if I spoke up and was wrong. I'd rather carry the second one." She hadn't meant to say it that plainly, hadn't meant to let that much of herself into the room. Marsh studied her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recognition. He had read her file when she transferred onto his team 18 months ago. He knew about Daniel, even if neither of them had ever said the name out loud in this office. "I'm not going to order you to drop this," he said finally, "but I'm also not going to walk it up the chain on a feeling. I need something I can put in front of Colonel Reyes that isn't just, Major Hayes has a bad feeling about the thermal data. Give me something concrete in the next 2 hours, and I'll take it to him myself." It wasn't a no. It also wasn't the full backing she'd hoped for, and she understood why. Marsh had his own name on this package. Going to Reyes meant spending some of his own credibility too, and he wasn't going to spend it cheaply. 2 hours, Olivia repeated. 2 hours. And Hayes... He stopped her at the door. "If you can't find anything more concrete than what you showed me, you let it go forward. You don't keep pulling this thread after that. There's a difference between doing your job carefully and refusing to accept an answer you don't like. I need you to be honest with yourself about which one you're doing." Olivia nodded and left, the weight of the deadline settling into her chest like something physical. 2 hours. 17 total before the window opened. 15 now before she needed to hand Marsh something solid enough to risk his own name on. She thought of Daniel again. Not the funeral, not her mother's hands folding that dish towel, but an earlier memory. The 2 of them on the back porch the summer before he shipped out. Daniel laughing at something and saying, "You worry too much, Liv. Somebody's got to actually live a little. He'd been the brave one. She'd always been the careful one. It had taken her years to understand that carefulness could be its own kind of courage, the unglamorous kind nobody wrote songs about. Back at her desk, she pulled every scrap of raw data she had. The original collection requirements, the source's reporting history, the exact metadata on every thermal frame from the last 5 nights, and started building the only kind of argument that would matter in the next 2 hours. Not a feeling, but a case. The 2 hours felt shorter than any 2 hours Olivia had lived through in years. She built her case the way she'd been trained to build any analytical product. Strip away the parts that depended on instinct. Keep only what could be shown, measured, and defended. She cross-referenced the source's 3 prior reports and found something she hadn't noticed before. In each of those cases, the source had filed within 6 hours of the activity observed. The current report was 11 days old by the time it reached final packaging. 11 days in which a compound's population, its purpose, even its occupants, could shift without anyone updating the file that mattered most. She pulled satellite imagery from a commercial provider, 2 days old, showing laundry strung along a line behind the second building, adult clothing, and smaller items beside it that she didn't want to name out loud until she was certain. She wasn't certain, but she had enough to stop being silent about it. At 04:10, she walked the printed packet into Marsh's office. He read it twice, asked her 4 sharp questions, and then picked up his phone. "Get me 5 minutes with Colonel Reyes," he said. "Before the brief. Tell him it's about the package." The video conference connected at 04:45. Reyes's face filling the screen from an operations center overseas, lit by a different kind of fluorescent light, but carrying the same exhausted, focused energy as every room Olivia had ever worked in. He had perhaps 6 hours before the strike window opened, and a dozen other things competing for those hours. "Major Hayes." His voice was clipped, not unfriendly, but a man who didn't waste words at this hour. "Colonel Marsh tells me you have a concern about the target package." "Yes, sir." Olivia kept her hands flat on the desk, her voice even. She had told herself in the elevator, "Don't oversell it, don't undersell it. Just say what you know and what you don't." "I'm not disputing that the compound has been used by an armed cell. The pattern of life data over 6 weeks supports that. My concern is narrower. Over the last 3 nights, thermal imagery shows movement signatures near the second structure that don't match the pattern established in the earlier weeks. Lower to the ground, shorter bursts, consistent with non-combatant presence, possibly children. The HUMANT report underlying the no civilian presence assessment is 11 days old. In this source's 3 prior taskings, reporting was filed within 6 hours of the observed activity. I believe the time gap here is significant enough that the original assessment may no longer reflect the site's current status. Reyes was quiet for a moment, his eyes flicking to something off-screen, likely the same imagery she'd already memorized. "What are you asking for, Major?" "A final reconnaissance pass before the window opens, not a delay of the operation. A confirmation, one way or the other, in the hours we still have. That window doesn't stay open forever. We lose the asset. We may not get this opportunity again for weeks. People on the ground are staged and waiting." Reyes's tone wasn't dismissive. It was the tone of a man laying the cost out plainly, the same way Marsh had laid it out for her 2 hours earlier. "Colonel Marsh, your assessment." Marsh glanced at Olivia, then back at the screen. "I signed off on this package, sir, and I stand behind the work that built it. But Major Hayes has identified a specific, time-bound discrepancy with a clear technical basis, not a general objection. I think the question deserves an answer before we commit." Reyes exhaled slowly. Somewhere behind him, someone said something Olivia couldn't make out, and he held up a hand without looking back. "Get me a recon asset over that compound in the next 90 minutes, he said. "Quiet pass, no change to ground posture, nothing that tips our hand if Major Hayes is wrong. I want eyes on before I authorize anything. Hayes, Dell. I want both of you reviewing that feed the second it comes in. No delay in reporting it to me, whichever way it falls." "Yes, sir," Olivia said, and the screen went dark. The 90 minutes that followed were the longest of Olivia's career. She sat beside Frank, who had come in early without being asked, his own concern for the work finally outweighing his certainty about it. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing useful left to say that hadn't already been said. At 06:12, the feed came through. The imagery was clean, high resolution, taken in the gray light just before dawn. The compound looked the same as it had for 6 weeks, until the camera held on the second building, and a door opened, and a woman stepped out into the yard carrying a child on her hip, followed by 2 more children, one of them small enough to still be unsteady on his feet. Frank didn't say anything. He just sat very still, watching, the way a man watches something he has been hoping not to see, and seeing anyway. The follow-on analysis came faster than either of them expected. A secondary thermal trace, picked up at the edge of the recon pass, showed vehicle and personnel activity at a smaller structure 400 meters east, a structure that had been logged in the original survey as an agricultural outbuilding and never flagged for further review. Within 20 minutes, signals analysis confirmed it. Communications traffic consistent with the cell's known patterns, originating from the second site, not the first. The original compound had been a family's shelter. The actual cache had moved, or had simply never been where the 6-week-old report said it was. Marsh relayed it to Reyes within the hour. The package was retargeted before the strike window closed, the corrected coordinates sent forward to the team already staged and waiting, men and women on the ground who would never know Olivia Hayes' name, who would only know that the target they hit that morning was the right one. The strike went forward at 09:30, 4 hours later than originally planned, against the correct target. Olivia watched the after-action summary come through in the same flat, procedural language all these reports came in. Coordinates, timestamps, confirmed effects on the structure, no friendly casualties, no civilian casualties. 6 words that meant a family she would never meet had woken up that morning, fed their children, and gone on living, never knowing how close the original plan had come to their door. She should have felt something like triumph. What she felt instead was a tired, complicated relief that didn't resolve into anything clean. Because the rest of the report wasn't as simple. The delay, the 90 minutes for reconnaissance, the additional hour to retarget, the time it took to move a strike package through a different chain of approval, had been enough. Signals intelligence picked up chatter in the hours after the strike suggesting at least 2 members of the cell, alerted by the activity near the original site, had relocated before the corrected strike went in. Not all of them. Not even most of the weapons believed to be cached there, but enough that the operation, by the only measure some people would ever care about, was incomplete. Marsh found her at her desk a little after noon, holding a printed copy of the final summary. "You did the right thing," he said, setting it down in front of her. "I want you to hear that plainly, because I know how your mind works, and I know you're already finding the part of this that isn't a clean win. We lost part of the cell. You saved a family that would be dead right now if we'd gone forward on the original package." Marsh sat on the edge of the desk beside hers, an informality he rarely allowed himself. "Both of those things are true at the same time, Hayes. That's the job. Nobody hands you a version of this where you get to feel good about everything. You did your work carefully, you were right about the thing that mattered most, and there's still a cost. That's not failure. That's Tuesday." He left her with that, and it didn't fix the unsettled feeling sitting in her chest, but it gave her somewhere to put it down for a while. Frank came by an hour later, coffee in hand, and stood at the edge of her desk the way he did when he had something to say, and hadn't yet decided how much of it he was going to say out loud. "I built that package wrong," he said finally. "Not carelessly. I followed the process, the source had a track record, the timeline made sense at the time. But I built it wrong, and you're the one who caught it, and I want you to know I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make myself feel better about it. You didn't build it wrong, Frank. The information changed. You worked with what you had. That's generous of you. I'm not sure I'd have been as generous in your position." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "For what it's worth, and I don't say this kind of thing easily, I'm glad you didn't let it go when I told you to. I was wrong to tell you that. You weren't wrong to push back. If I'd been wrong, you'd have been right to." Frank almost smiled at that, the closest he came to it most days. Maybe that's the job too, both of us doing what we're supposed to do, and one of us turning out to be right. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closed a conversation between two people who didn't need many more words to understand each other, and walked back to his desk. Olivia sat alone for a while after that, the operations center humming around her the same way it had at 02:14 that morning, as if no time had passed at all, as if the last 10 hours hadn't held an entire war's worth of weight inside them. She opened her desk drawer and took out the photograph she kept there. Daniel on the back porch, 19 years old, sunburned and laughing at something just out of frame. 2 years before a war he never should have lost would take him over a gap of 3 days nobody caught in time. She didn't take it out often. She didn't need to look at it to remember why she did this work. But today felt like a day that asked for it. You worry too much, Liv. Maybe, but somebody had to. Somebody had to sit in a windowless room at 2 in the morning and notice the shadow in the thermal data that didn't match the pattern, and have the nerve to say so even when saying so cost something. Credibility, time, the comfort of letting someone else's judgment stand unquestioned. Nobody would write a story about what she'd done that night. There would be no medal, no headline, nothing beyond a line in an after-action report that a family at one location had been correctly identified as non-combatant prior to strike authorization. That was the whole of it, as far as the official record would ever say. She put the photograph back in the drawer, closed it, and pulled up the next case file waiting in her queue. A different province, a different compound, a different set of numbers that would need someone to sit with them long enough to notice what they were actually saying. The war didn't pause for what she'd gotten right that morning. It simply moved forward, the way it always did. And she moved forward with it, back to the screen, back to the quiet, invisible work of deciding, one careful hour at a time, who would come home. And that's where we leave Major Olivia Hayes. Not on a battlefield, not receiving a medal in front of cameras, but sitting back down at her desk, opening the next file, because that's what the job actually looks like. No parade, no applause. Just one more set of numbers waiting for someone careful enough to notice what they're really saying. If this story moved you, I hope it's because you recognized something true in it. War isn't only fought by the people who carry rifles. It's fought by the ones who carry responsibility in quieter ways. Analysts, medics, logisticians, the people in windowless rooms making decisions that never make the news, but that decide every single day who comes home and who doesn't. Olivia never fired a weapon in this story. She didn't need to. Her courage looked like something else entirely. The willingness to question 6 weeks of work, to risk her own credibility, to keep pushing when the easier thing would have been to stay quiet and let someone else's judgment stand. That's the kind of strength we don't talk about enough. It doesn't look like the movies. It looks like someone staying late, reading the same report a third time, trusting a feeling enough to chase it down with facts. And I think that's worth honoring just as much as any story with explosions and gunfire. Maybe more, because it's closer to how the real military actually works, and closer to the kind of sacrifice that so many people make without ever being seen for it. If you're a veteran, or you know someone who served in roles like Olivia's, intelligence, logistics, medical, support, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. These stories live because of the people who actually lived them, and I read every single comment you leave. If this story stayed with you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Stories about the people who serve in ways that don't always get recognized. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more stories coming. Stories about the medics who hold someone's hand in their last minutes. The mechanics who keep aircraft in the sky through sheer stubbornness and skill. The young recruits who walk in scared and walk out changed. The veterans who carry their service quietly for the rest of their lives. Thank you for spending this time with me, and thank you for caring about stories like Olivia's. These men and women deserve to be remembered, not just for the moments that make headlines, but for the thousands of quiet, careful hours nobody ever sees. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.